Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Stephanie Allman, and I'm the National Director of Employment Services at Upwardly Global. At Upwardly Global, I know most of you here are very familiar with us. We work to support people who are new to the United States as they navigate the professional job search. We're here to ensure that job seekers have the tools they need to find jobs in the United States that leverage the strengths, education, and experience that they bring with them from their home countries. So for those of you watching who have recently come to the United States, welcome. We're so glad to have you with us at Upwardly Global and today as part of this presentation. Daniel and Jill are special guests that we have with us today from Fragomen, which is the leading immigration law firm in the United States. Daniel and Jill have prepared an overview of the important information to know about the legal pathways in the US. Daniel and Jill, thank you so much for being here and for your time and for your expertise. I'll let you introduce yourselves from here.
Thank you, Stephanie. My name is Daniel, and as Stephanie said, I am a lawyer at the firm Fragomen, and I'm joined by my colleague, Jill. Jill and I are part of a team that, among other things, tries to help people who are fleeing humanitarian situations in their country. It takes a lot of different forms and a lot of different legal mechanisms at play. But we know that these have been some pretty terrible times for you and your family, that you probably have a lot of questions. You want to understand your legal status here in the US. You want to understand what you need to do next and how you might be able to build a life here in the future. And so we're going to walk through some of the basics of US immigration law that affect you and your status and your family. And then we're going to talk through some of the more practical considerations. Can I work and when? Can I get a driver's license? Can I enroll my kid in school? All of those questions where your immigration status matters, at least around the edges to some of that. So I'm going to start. Why don't we proceed to the next slide? I'm going to start with the main ways that Ukrainians have come to the United States. I assume if you're joining this call that you've come through one of these mechanisms, but I just want to highlight that there are different sets of people and sets of ways that you've gotten here, and how you got here affects your continued path and affects what is available now. Some of you, I assume, were already here when the war happened. You were previously granted status. Maybe you were a student on an F-1 visa. Maybe you were here working for an employer. The good news is, whatever status you had, you should be able to maintain, even though there's a war that has broken out. One mechanism that is going to be available to you, though, because you were already here by April 11th, is something called TPS, Temporary Protected Status. You may have already heard of that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it in a minute. But if you were here on April 11th in some other status, you should also be eligible for TPS. I know a lot of you have started coming in more recently through the Uniting for Ukraine program. We're going to call that U4U. It's a little complicated to say Uniting for Ukraine a bunch of times. That's a program that has been recently set up and that lets people come in as a parolee. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means as well. But basically, it's not a visa status, but it is being here with permission. Those people, the Uniting for Ukraine people, aren't eligible for TPS because they came in after April 11th. But you will be able to apply for work authorization, employment authorization, and receive some benefits that Jill is going to go through in a minute. And then finally, I know that there was a period, if you weren't already here when the war broke out and you didn't come in more recently, there was a period where you entered maybe using a B1 visitor visa. And those are people who, it's a bit complicated, frankly, your situation in the United States, and we'll talk about why. But they're essentially, if you came in before April 11th, you are eligible for TPS and can apply and get work authorization. Sometimes you'll hear us say an EAD, an employment authorization document. That's the card you need to be able to work in the United States. If you came in before April 11th, you can apply for TPS and then get work authorization through that. If you came in after April 11th, unfortunately, there is no TPS available for you and you can't currently seek to work. And we'll talk a little bit about possible paths for you. But basically, you may be able to find another status here in the US. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So one critical question is, how long am I going to be able to stay? The different mechanisms that you might have used to get here have different amounts of time associated with them. So for example, if you came in on U4U, that Uniting for Ukraine, you were almost certainly given 24 months, 2 years from your date of entry to be here in the United States. People were coming in, if you came in on parole separately from Uniting for Ukraine, some people were going to Mexico and presenting themselves at the border. That's another category of people. And I believe in practice that varied, but you just should check your what's called an I-94 record. You can check and see how long you were admitted through. The border officer may have said how long, but typically that was either a year or 2 years. Temporary protected status is a grant for 18 months. So if you're eligible for that and you get it, it's going to be an 18-month grant through October 2023. If you're a B1 visitor and you can't apply for TPS, you should be aware that typically, at least, you're given 6 months from when you entered to do something else. We talk about what that something else is. It might be renewing your B, it might be finding something else. And then if you have another current status, maybe you were here as a student, well, that's going to vary, and you should probably consult with an immigration lawyer, frankly, because there's so many different complexities. But in any case, you'll probably be able to apply for TPS. Okay, let's go to the next slide. I want to clarify a few things because there's a lot of confusion as you start trying to do research yourself, as you start trying to understand your own status and what's available. There are a lot of complicated words, frankly, in US immigration law, and some do and do not apply to you. One thing that is very common is to refer to anyone fleeing their country for reasons like war or famine or those kinds of things as a refugee. People will consistently refer to Afghan refugees, Ukrainian refugees. You'll hear that on the news. And unfortunately, in immigration law, it's much narrower. It's not just that you were forced to flee, but it's a special kind of status. And it's extended to people who have fled their country and who can't go back because they fear harm based on a protected ground, like their religion or their nationality or something. Refugee status is a long process abroad, and a lot of people were looking at that before Uniting for Ukraine. Can I come in as a refugee? And the answer was, well, if you can wait 2 or 3 years, because that's typically the refugee process abroad can be very lengthy. Uniting for Ukraine was a way of just sort of getting people here, but you did not come in if you came into Uniting for Ukraine as a refugee, and that's critical to understand your rights and what happens next. For example, there is a pathway toward a green card, an immigrant visa, if you came in as a refugee, but if you didn't come in as a refugee, that path is not available. Asylum, however, is a related protection that you can seek from within the US. And that is a very complicated area of the law that I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about. But basically, if you fear returning to Ukraine, and again, based on the government or some force the government can't control, hurting you because of your religion, your nationality or ethnic background, etc., you may qualify. Asylum is very complicated and you should seek a lawyer's help, but I wanted to flag it because it's sort of the flip side of the coin from refugee, and a lot of Ukrainians may ultimately be able to qualify for asylum. Just one more point on asylum, which is that you usually have to seek it within a year of coming into the country. There are exceptions and various other things. It's more complicated, but you should probably, if you're thinking, is asylum right for me, you should start thinking about trying to find asylum counsel or trying to find a lawyer to help you out and figure that out. My advice would be to wait until around the year mark, just maybe wait a few more months, because the situation in Ukraine itself is also going to drive who qualifies and how they qualify. That said, so basically, you're not a refugee most likely if you came into Uniting for Ukraine or in these other programs. But there are 2 other terms you're going to hear and see a lot, and I want to make sure you understand those. One is the word immigrant. You hear that word used more broadly. In immigration, it's a little more narrow, and it's basically the people who live in the United States permanently. You'll also hear them called permanent residents or LPRs, and you'll also hear it referred to as a green card. The visa itself is a green card. There are lots of different ways to get permanent residence in the US. I mentioned asylum earlier, that eventually asylum and refugee both eventually lead to a green card. You might be able to be eligible for a green card because of family ties. If you are related closely to a US citizen, that might be possible. And then employers can, in some circumstances, sponsor people for employment-based immigrant visas. Non-immigrants are people who are here temporarily, and this is where it gets a little complicated. Most of you are non-immigrants or are here in a temporary quasi status, we would say. If you're here on a B1, for example, you're clearly a non-immigrant. If you get TPS, that's a status. It's not a permanent status. I would say it's non-immigrant. And then parole is permission to remain here, although you don't have a visa status like B1 or F1. And it's also temporary. As we noted, it's a 2-year period for most Ukrainians. That's the basic legal framework that I want you to have in mind. And now Jill is going to talk through a little bit of the more practical considerations as you start building your life here in the US.
Thank you, Daniel. So we just walked through, we should also mention that if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and feel free. I know our Upflow folks are going to help us to try to answer those in a timely manner. But if you are a Ukrainian in a work eligible status that we've mentioned, so that's you for you, if you entered as another kind of parolee across the border, if you are going to be applying for temporary protected status, then these are some of the permissions that you are going to be able to have in the United States. First of all, you are work eligible. So once you have your employment authorization document, you will be able to work legally. Driving, I know transportation can be a big question for people when they're first coming to the United States. So we'll talk about the driving permissions and the driver's licenses and how it unfortunately varies a great deal from state to state, as well as your ability to rent a place, to access community resources, to get your children into schools, for instance, to apply for certain benefits that you are eligible for, which again vary on your status. And then lastly, to seek a more permanent immigration status, depending on what your unique situation will allow. Now, if you are a person who came through the Uniting for Ukraine program, that means that you have a US-based person sponsoring and supporting you. So this person and possibly their family and friends and wider network is really a critical partner in helping to get you connected to all of the things that you are eligible for and things that you need to apply for. Having an English speaker to help you navigate those processes and people who are familiar with it is a tremendously valuable resource. So, when your sponsor signed up to support you, that is one of the things that they were agreeing to. So please, you should definitely see that person as sort of your the first person who you may ask for help with on some of these critical tasks. If you are here legally and have sufficient income once you are legally working, you would also be able to sponsor other Ukrainian nationals through the Uniting for Ukraine program. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on, but I just wanted to flag that for you if you are hoping to bring additional family members or friends from Ukraine over as well. Now, one critical theme of this presentation is sort of the difference between immigration law, which is federal and sort of the same across all of the states and the District of Columbia, versus, things like a driver's license or accessing or enrolling for school. These are things that are going to vary a lot based on what state you happen to be in, and even sometimes by the individual town or counties. There's a lot of variation by where exactly you are. So some of the advice and practical tips that we offer are going to be at a little bit more of a general level. And that's precisely because there are a lot of differences depending on where you are. So even if you're in California and your experience is one way and you have a friend in Pennsylvania, that friend's experience might be somewhat different. So I just wanted to raise that for you, and the difference of immigration law being federal and everything else being local is the reason for those differences. Okay, so getting to work. I know this is something everyone is excited about on this presentation, since you've already done such a good job and then connected with Upwardly Global that will help you to use the skills that you have. So first of all, you cannot work legally in the United States until you have your employment authorization document, or EAD. That is a physical card that you receive in the mail from USCIS. So it doesn't count if you have already applied and maybe you have a receipt of some sort. It does not count until you have an actual physical card in your hand. Then you can start to seek employment and be hired somewhere. So that's a very important thing to mention. You can apply for the immigration authorization document only when you're here in the United States, which you all are, and you use the form I-765, which is available on the USCIS website. This is about a 12-page form, and you want to fill it out very carefully. Again, if you are a U4U parolee, be sure to ask your sponsor for help in preparing it and checking things over. There are different eligibility category codes that affect what kind of evidence you need to submit, what questions you need to answer on the form in some cases, and also the fees that you'll have to pay to get your employment authorization document. So you can find what particular code you may have in the form's instructions, but I wanted to just flag a few common codes that you're probably, that may pertain to you right now. So if you are a person who entered under the Uniting for Ukraine program, or if you were granted parole at the border, your code is going to be C11. For people who are applying for temporary protected status, you can apply for a work permit at the same time that you're applying for that temporary protected status. And the code that you'll want to use in that case is C19. And then lastly, if you happen to be seeking asylum or something like that, then C8 is going to be your code. Those are what I judge to be probably the most common codes for you. Like I said, the fees involved can vary. Sometimes it's $0, sometimes it's $410. In certain categories, you have to pay a biometrics fee. So it's really important to go to the USCIS fee calculator to figure out exactly how much your employment authorization document in this form will cost you to submit. Again, this is something that your sponsor, if you came as a U4U parolee, can assist with in terms of paying. And we do really strongly recommend paying the full fee for these to avoid any kind of processing delays. There is a fee waiver process, but it sort of adds a mountain of paperwork and slows things down significantly. And the other way to do the best filing you can, prepare all of the evidence, very thorough, check every box, sign every form properly so that they can't come back and ask for more information that will make the process take a longer time. Now, of course, everyone's burning question is how long is it going to take to get the work permit? And unfortunately, that is a very difficult question to answer right now because we haven't seen we don't have enough information for the people who more recently applied for this status. You know, this was only a few months ago. Employment authorization documents can take some time. So it's really very unclear right now what the timelines are for parolees or TPS applicants and other Ukrainians. However, USCIS has indicated they are willing to be sort of sensitive to the special situation that Ukrainians find themselves in. So I think it's worth it in every case to request what's called an expedite, which means just to make the case go faster. And what you want to include is sort of a cover sheet of paper that says expedite, as well as an explanation of why is this so urgent for you, given the fact that you have fled your country, you need to be able to support yourself. That may help move things along a little bit faster. Now, if you have already applied for your employment authorization document and are waiting, if you did not already do so, please request an expedite. And you can do that by calling the USCIS hotline or through their chat box on their website. So you can say expedite request, and then be sure to have your receipt handy so that you can provide the necessary information. And it's worth a try. They can say no, but it is certainly worth the effort. I do see that we have one question, but I think that one we will table towards the end. I will go on to the next one. Okay, driving. Some communities have pretty good public transportation like buses. If you're in a larger metropolitan area, you may be able to use public transportation such as a subway or metro system, or just walk. But there are many parts of the United States where people really depend on cars to get around. And to drive a car as a foreign national who's going to be here not just a few weeks or a couple months, but for a longer term, such as 18 months to 2 years at least, you are going to want to get a driver's license in the state where you live. So the Department of Motor Vehicles, you often hear this as the DMV, in the individual state where you live is the best resource for the information and requirements for getting a license in that state. As I mentioned, things vary by state, and driver's licenses are definitely one of those things that have some pretty major differences across. But generally, what states require when you are applying for a driver's license is documents that prove your identity, who you are, your immigration status, and proof that you live in the state where you're seeking a driver's license. So in that case, you might need a passport or a receipt from some immigration filing or your social security card. I recommend whenever you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles to just take every possible document that you think would be relevant and bring it, because you don't want to stand in a long line and not have the information that you need. I also wanted to note that some states that are listed below here, there are 16 states and the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., that actually issue driver's licenses to people who don't have any kind of documentation, who may have crossed the border illegally or that sort of thing. So if you are still waiting on, let's say, your social security card or something to be issued by USCIS, in these particular states, you may be able to just go ahead and get a driver's license right away. And that driver's license, when it is tied to your status and your legal authorized stay in the United States, is going to expire when that does. So if you go into the Department of Motor Vehicles and you show that you are a parolee and you are here legally for 2 years, that is exactly the time that your state driver's license will also expire. We have a whole slide on driving and a couple of do's and don'ts later on regarding driving, because driving is actually something that, while it seems completely unrelated to immigration, can also often have some pretty serious immigration consequences. So we always want you to be following the law when you are driving. And we have this question over here of, can you drive if you don't have a driver's license? No, you need to be licensed. And if you're going to be, as I said, in the state for several months, you need to get that state's driver's license. So it's really important not to drive without a license or to drive recklessly or dangerously, because it can create some pretty major immigration consequences. And it's just not worth the risk. Renting a place to live. If you came as a U4U parolee, you may already have a place to live thanks to your sponsor. or if you came in through family relationships, and that's totally fine. But you can also rent a house or an apartment that may fit your needs and budget when the time comes. One thing that can be kind of frustrating for people who are coming from a different country when they're trying to rent a place in the United States is the fact that there aren't records showing that you are a good person who pays on time and who keeps the apartment neat, doesn't have sort of that credit history or that rental history and that can create some hesitation with certain landlords. So there are a couple things that can be helpful when you're trying to establish yourself as a person in the United States and looking for a place to rent. And one thing is to have someone, it could be your sponsor if you're a U4U, or a family member or a relative or even a coworker, help you when you're looking for housing. Just having someone, maybe an American friend or a Ukrainian American friend, to be by your side can be tremendously helpful in the process when working with the landlord. But also they can point you to the areas that are safe and have maybe good transportation or decent schools. That kind of input can be very helpful. In addition, another way to sort of overcome the problem of not having those records of paying bills on time and being a good tenant in a rental property is you could have somebody co-sign with you for the rental lease. And that means that if you, for some reason, were not able to pay your bills, then that person would be required to pay those bills, so the landlord can feel safe knowing that there are two parties that could pay them if something goes wrong. One other thing that I want to flag for a rental lease agreement, it can be really helpful for immigration purposes if everyone is listed on the rental document. For instance, if you are applying for temporary protected status, it's helpful to have you and your children listed on the lease, because that can serve later on as evidence of your residence at the time that is required. Now, one thing to point out is that even though it can seem a little bit harder when you are new to the country, US fair housing laws do prohibit landlords from discriminating against people based on where they're from, their religion, or their immigration status. So just be aware of that you are protected in that way. And the last thing is, when you move, you have to update your address with USCIS within 10 days of you moving. And it's a very simple process. You just go online to the USCIS website and fill out the online AR11. It probably takes about 15 minutes, and you put in your old address and then you add in your new address. And that's really important, because if you have applied for a work permit, but you haven't received it yet, and they send it to the wrong address, that will further delay things for you. So it's always a good idea to make sure that USCIS has your most current address on file. Accessing community resources. So school, for those of you that have school-age children, roughly from about the age of 5 to 18 or 19, you can register your children in your local public school at no cost to you. And the requirements for enrolling your child in school, again, varies by the location where you're at. So the best thing to do is to check your local school district website and find out how to register. And just so you know, kids usually go back to school in the United States, almost everywhere here, somewhere in August to September timeframe. So if your children are not already registered for school, it may be worthwhile to visit your local school and see what's needed for registration, just so you'll be ready for the back to school season. If your children are smaller, there are Head Start or preschool classes for some children who are under 5 years old. So it's worthwhile to look and see if the community where you're in has that available for your children as well. In most cases, you will need to show the proof of your child's identity, their age, proof of where you live in the community, and also vaccinations to register. Now, realizing that many of you may have left Ukraine very quickly and may not have been able to grab all of your documents, sometimes the vaccination records or even the identity records can be a bit of a problem. So if you do have a copy at least of an identity document and a vaccine record, maybe it's already in, if it's not already in English, it can be very helpful to have it translated into English. And then you can go to a local clinic near you, a public clinic, and see if they can verify the vaccination and sort of certify it for school purposes. In some cases, it may be necessary for your child to get another vaccine that maybe wasn't available in Ukraine to be on the US schedule, but I encourage you to do that if you need to register children for school. The second part of accessing community resources is to just flag that local public libraries can be a tremendous source of great information and resources for your new community. If you do not have a printer, or if you have a hard time with computer access and maybe you're just using your phone, but you really need a computer to file something more serious, most libraries offer computer access with the internet as well as printer access, which can be very helpful to you. In many cases, you can make copies. They are a great resource available as you are needing to do certain filings or certain work. In addition, the library can be sort of a community hub. So it'll publicize local events that you may wish to attend. Many of them offer classes, including English classes. And some libraries actually even provide some immigration assistance. And lastly, of course, the library is great for checking out books. If you want to read something about your field that you're entering and trying to learn all of the English words for the field that you're entering for work purposes, or to entertain your children, you can get a library card for free by just proving that you are living at the address that you're at. So I highly recommend your local public library as a great starting point for getting integrated and connected to your new community. Okay, applying for benefits. So once you are working and employed with a company, you can sign up for any private benefit program that's available through your employer that you can afford. Most US employers offer health insurance, life insurance, dental and eye care coverage, that sort of thing. So anything that is a private benefit through the employment, through the employer is sort of normally how most Americans actually get their health coverage. For Ukrainians who came through the Uniting for Ukraine process and are now parolees, your sponsor can help you to identify what public benefit programs you might be eligible for, and they can help you file the applications for those things as you're waiting for your work authorization and your job to start. In addition, under the Additional Ukraine Supplemental Appropriations Act, the US Congress actually granted people who arrived through the U4U program benefits that are similar to those that official status refugees receive. And so that can help you to resettle in the United States and have a little bit of help with food if you need it, some Medicaid coverage, and that sort of thing. So the benefits listed here, like Medicaid for medical coverage, the temporary assistance for needy families, and the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or SNAP, those are all federal programs. So for the whole United States, it doesn't matter where you are, those programs are available to you if you came for under the U4U program. However, in different states, there may also be some state-specific programs that you might be eligible for also. Some states offer separate health insurance for children, and extra unemployment benefits, all sorts of things. So be sure to check out the things that are available to you in your local area. Now, TPS eligible people who are eligible for that temporary protected status, some people, if they are under the age of 19 or if they're pregnant, they may also be eligible for certain additional benefits. Most benefits are not available to them, so you have to fit in that very narrow category. But the bottom line is that benefits eligibility, whether you're actually eligible to get different programs in the United States, can be quite complicated and is definitely not my specialty either. So we recommend consulting your local resettlement coordinator, a benefits coordinator, or a social worker to sort of help you and also your sponsor to navigate what programs you may benefit from. There has been some concern that the public charge rule from under the Trump administration may be a problem for Ukrainians. So people may hesitate to try to enroll in certain benefits programs because they don't want to be considered a burden on the US government or cost the government money. And I want to take a moment to sort of dispel that thought, because benefits that Congress has made available specifically to Ukrainians really cannot be used to consider you a public charge or anything like that. So your sponsor can help you to determine, or a social worker can help you determine the public benefits, but you do not have to worry specifically about the public charge case for this. I mentioned a little bit about what vaccines are necessary for schools. If you are here on the U4U program, you are required to complete a tuberculosis screening within 2 weeks of arrival. So that's something you can also usually do at your public health clinic, but be sure to fill in, have that tuberculosis screening, and also fill in any vaccination gaps that you agreed to address as soon as possible to make sure that you're meeting the conditions of your parole and that you are just doing the right thing.
I will say that literally while we are doing this presentation, I just got an email from USCIS saying that now people are going to have 90 days to do that screening. So the slide is slightly out of date. Now you will have 90 days, which is a little bit better for you because it may be difficult to do that in 2 weeks.
Oh, great. Very timely update there. Okay, I'm going to turn it actually back over to Daniel for some important do's and don'ts while you're here in the United States.
So I just want to very quickly walk through some things that, some issues that we see come up with people, and people are afraid of affecting their future immigration status and that sort of thing. Especially people who are here on parole. That is a revocable thing. The US government could say, nope, never mind, no more parole for you. So it is critical that you stay on the right side of the law in the United States. Don't break the law. We have a lot of people who do what would be considered minor infractions. You know, for example, in the United States, driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs, that's obviously a terrible thing to do, but it might just be a misdemeanor where you are. It might be a relatively low level crime, but it can be very, very tough from an immigration perspective. It's also critical that you don't work without an employment authorization document. That means don't go and exchange your services for money. You will be asked on future immigration paperwork, have you ever worked without authorization? Don't do that. Don't use drugs or alcohol. And also use alcohol at your discretion. Don't drive under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Using drugs also, even possession of very small amount of drugs in the United States can have drastic consequences. And then don't vote. You're not eligible to vote until you become a US citizen, in most places at least. And it's also critical that you not be perceived as holding yourself out as a US citizen. You'll be asked that. Have you ever said that you were a US citizen when you weren't? Things that you should do: meet filing deadlines. That means if you need to renew your status, let's say TPS status or your B status, be sure to do that on time. And what that means can vary from application to application, but typically you do that before it expires. One other critical thing that they're going to care about, and we had some questions about, is Uniting for Ukraine going to affect future benefits? Can I still get a tourist visa, et cetera? And the answer, I think, by and large, is going to be yes. It's not, Uniting for Ukraine is a special program. I don't think it's going to impact people's future ability, provided that they depart the US on time. If they don't renew Uniting for Ukraine, if you haven't found a more permanent way of staying here at the end of that 2 years, it is going to be critical that you depart, because overstaying your visa is something that will count negatively against you, but being here on parole is not. As Jill said, keep your address updated with USCIS. It is a requirement. And then we flagged that there are lots of restrictions right now on technology and money and things flowing into like Russian controlled parts of Ukraine. There are all of these sanctions laws. It's very complicated. If you're thinking of doing something like that, you really need to check the rules. Let's go to the next slide. I know that the main question on everyone's mind is, okay, I'm here for this 2 years, 18 months, whatever it is, but what comes next? To some extent, that's an open question that's going to be decided over the next few years. For example, it may be that TPS gets extended and extended, or that the date changes. It may be that the parole gets extended, et cetera. So you may be able to stay here longer. We just don't know that. There is no dedicated path to permanent residence or a green card for Ukrainians who came in. So that may happen eventually. They may say, you know, Ukrainians here on U4U, there's a special green card created for you. I think that's unlikely. More likely is that you might be able to build a more permanent path through some of these other mechanisms. And those are all very complicated, too complicated to discuss on a webinar like this. But as I said, if you've got US family members, if you qualify for asylum, if your employer wants to sponsor you for permanent residence, you may be able to build a longer term life here. On the last one, because I know a lot of you are going to hopefully become employed before too long, you know, that's a question to ask your employer. Might you be willing to sponsor me for a green card for permanent residence? And what does that look like here? It's an expensive and lengthy process, and getting the conversation started sooner rather than later, if that's something you're interested in, is probably a good thing. And it may simply be that your employer doesn't want to sponsor people for green cards or doesn't do it very often. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, because I think we're pressed for time. I want to leave plenty of time for questions. Okay, so there were a couple of questions that we received before that we didn't get to fully, but one of the more critical questions that I saw in the chat and that I believe somebody asked before is, if I came in on a B1 in April, after April 11th, so I can't qualify for TPS, can I or should I try to go out and get Uniting for Ukraine and come back in? That's a question a lot of people are asking, and frankly, there isn't a great answer for that. Right now, if you're in a B1 and you came in after April 11th, you're in sort of a gap. There isn't a great way of, you may be eligible for other things, like maybe if you wanted to go to college or go get a master's degree, you might switch to F1 student status. But it's weird because you're not eligible for a lot of the benefits that Uniting for Ukraine people are eligible for. And you don't have the 2-year period, you only have 6 months. And so it can be frustrating. No one really knows whether the Uniting for Ukraine is going to be given to people who have B visas and have been here for a while. It makes me a bit nervous, frankly, to tell people to leave the country and try to get back in. But I will say the Uniting for Ukraine program has been very quick, and it's been, largely people getting approved. And so it may be that you just decide it's worth the chance. You'd still need a sponsor. You need to be aware that you need to be abroad for, typically what we're seeing is that within about 3 or 4 weeks, most people can complete the process. They can get the sponsor approved and then get their own travel approved and then present themselves at the border. So, but you need a month to be somewhere, count on it, maybe longer if things get hung up for one reason or another. But, that's a critical question, is what do I do if I'm here on a B? And we've been pressuring the government, honestly, to answer that question or, for more information. And there isn't a great answer yet. It may be they move the date for TPS forward a little bit to help you out. It may be that we start hearing that people are going out and coming back in on U4U, and that's not an issue. But really, that's up to you. Do you have a sponsor? Are you willing to go, for a month abroad? You may face questions about why you were doing this, et cetera, at the border. But if you're prepared to answer them, it may be worth the shot. But again, I hesitate to tell people definitely go outside of the country and come back if you're already here and trying to get settled in. So I feel like we talked a lot. I think we've talked through a lot of the questions, but Stephanie, I don't know if you want, if there are any that, or the upload team, are there any questions we didn't fully cover, and we can talk through those issues.
Well, first, Daniel and Jill, I want to thank you again for being here and for this incredibly informative presentation. I know that this information is very useful to the participants that are joining us today and those that will be viewing this as a recording later. So we're grateful for your time and your expertise here. I do want to encourage anyone who's currently on the call to put any more questions that they have. If you have any questions that weren't answered here, in the chat, and Daniel and Jill will do their best to answer those questions. In the meantime, while we're seeing if more questions come in, I can go back to some of the questions that we received before the presentation, and there may be just some opportunities to highlight some of the answers, even if already covered. So there was one question that came in from someone saying, I would like to work, but can't do it legally. And I would appreciate to hear how to change the situation and receive a job permit faster, or any other ways to solve this problem. What are the options that this individual might have, given that question?
So as Jill said, no one really knows at this point how long employment authorization is going to take. Unfortunately, we haven't yet started seeing people actually get approved for the employment authorizations. As she flagged, there are ways to request an expedite with USCIS to say, can you please, hurry with my case, by calling them, by going to their website and requesting an expedite. But, unfortunately, it's we've had many thousands of Ukrainians coming in, and everybody would like to work sooner rather than later. And I can tell you, Uniting for Ukraine was a very interesting program, because it's very quickly getting people here. But unfortunately, a lot of the immigration system in the United States is just subject to a lot of delays. And so you just need to be prepared. It may take 6 months or 9 months for my employment authorization document to get here. And unfortunately, there's very little anybody can practically do to make that move any faster. And so it's worth trying, but it may not succeed, and you may end up just needing to wait for a while. And in the meantime, developing your skills, English classes, those sorts of things are perfectly fine to engage in. You just simply can't engage in work.
This last question that just came in is a great question from the perspective of a sponsor. Mm-hmm. So if someone I sponsor violates the law, would this affect me? Such as if that person they're sponsoring works without a permit or overstays their visa. Are there implications for the sponsor?
I think as a general matter, no. A sponsor's obligations are to help the person, to help them get on their feet here in the United States. Certainly, I think that you don't want to be participating in some kind of scheme to, help them get a job when they can't work or something like that. That could be a crime. But simply the fact that, you bring somebody here, you start helping them, and then they go off and do something that's unlawful or, that you don't like, I don't think that you would be on the hook for that. But that's a great question. There's been a shifting idea about what the sponsorship obligations are, because initially it was there were no public benefits available for Uniting for Ukraine, and it was going to be giving them all of the money they need to survive for a year or two. And now it's something less than that. I think there's still an obligation to help people get on their feet and that sort of thing. But now that there are benefits available, helping them get signed up for the benefits is more your role. So. But I don't think they would go after you if the person goes and gets a job. But I would tell your person that you're sponsoring, by the way, you cannot work in the United States, and that will be a very negative thing on future immigration benefits, et cetera.
There's another question that's here that I think is both a question and perhaps an opportunity for further clarity. Mm-hmm. So the question here is, can you leave the US if you are on U4U? or do you need to get an advanced parole? So I think the clarity around the second part would be great as far as definitions go, and then answer to the question around leaving the US.
So that's a great question. For those of you who are not familiar, parole is how the people on Uniting for Ukraine are here with, they're not in a status, they're just here with permission. Confusingly, there's a separate word, advance parole, which is where you get advance permission to go out and come back into the United States. To my knowledge, a parolee, a person who's already here on parole, cannot get advance parole to come back in. Maybe that's something I'm just unfamiliar with. I think, and as you may be aware, Uniting for Ukraine was a one-time entry only thing. So if you need to go back abroad, I think that the proper course is to seek another Uniting for Ukraine entry. And I am not familiar yet with how those are going, if anyone has had to do that. So that's something of an open question. But to my knowledge, I don't think you can seek advance parole based on a parole like Uniting for Ukraine. Jill, I don't know if you disagree with that, and maybe you're familiar with it, but that's a weird thing, frankly, for a parolee to try to do. That's more typical when someone is waiting for some immigration benefit to be decided and they can't travel except with that.
Yeah, I'm checking on the form if it sheds any light.
I should flag that an advanced parole, even if that is the proper course, let's say that you could do that, those also take a long time. So if you need to travel, let's say you have relatives leaving Ukraine that you need to go tend to, you just be prepared, even if that is the right mechanism, which I don't think it is, it's going to take 6 months plus at least for that permission to come in. So almost certainly it will be faster to go out and hopefully get back in on Uniting for Ukraine.
Yeah, I think in general, what we would typically counsel our clients is like, you should generally try to be here for the length of your parole. It's much safer because, as Daniel mentioned before, it's a very discretionary process. And that means that the people at the border can kind of do whatever they want. They don't have to let you back in. And there's really no way for you to get back on track if you're not allowed in that case.
And we've seen, most people, as I said, getting Uniting for Ukraine approvals and everything is going smoothly, but then sometimes there are technical glitches and people can't quite figure out why their request is just sitting there for a long time. My concern is that they don't really have a great mechanism for getting back in on Uniting for Ukraine, applying again, and it'll mess something up in the system and cause delays at minimum. So I agree with that. Be aware, if I were you, absent a true emergency, I would definitely try to stay here for the full amount of time.
Another question here, and I know that this has been answered, but perhaps if you could just reiterate again, given the question is here in the chat, can I get a work visa if I came with parole?
That's a good question. Parole, because of the sort of weird place it is in the immigration system, it's not a status. So that means you cannot change your status from it. Let's say you were here as a student and you would have a visa status, an F1 status. And then an employer said, hey, I want to employ you. I will sponsor an H-1B visa, which is one of the main work visas for you. If that was successful, you as a student could file what's called a change of status request. I want to change from F to H-1B. That would mean you didn't have to go abroad and get the visa and everything else. You just switch automatically in the system. Parolees can't do that. So you can't go from parole to H-1B or parole to L1 or all these other work visa categories. So unfortunately, the answer is no. If an employer wants to do that for you, they can seek it. They can get, that approval, but then you have to go to a consulate abroad. You have to go to Canada or Europe or somewhere and go through the consular process. And I will flag, one of the benefits of Uniting for Ukraine is not having to go to consulates right now, which are a mess because of COVID and other backlogs. Getting an appointment and getting back into the country could just take months and months. A lot of people are avoiding that at all costs. So the answer, in short, is largely no. If you're here on a B1, however, this is one of the interesting distinctions. If you are here on a B1, you can change your status to something else. As I mentioned, if you wanted to say, let's go do a master's or university program, you could change to F1 and do that. And then from there, change to H-1B or something at the end of it. So, but the parole status is limited in that way.
So for folks who are here on parole, does slide 11 answer the question of what are the options from here? Is that right?
Yeah, could we go back to slide 11 just so I can take a look?
I will try.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Slide 11 is
12.
slide 12.
Perhaps.
So it does. So
or is it suggested to stay in the parole status? I think that just zooming out for someone on parole, what should they do?
So parole, as I said, you can't go get another non-immigrant status. You can't go get a student status or a work status like H-1B. Unusually, though, parolees can adjust status. And so without going into all of the details, you can go from parole to immigrant to permanent resident. So these pathways here that we've identified on the slide are ways to essentially change from parole to something permanent. If you've got close US family members, if you apply for asylum, if an employer wants to sponsor you, not for a temporary period, but for permanent residence, that's the conversation that you need to have. So as a parolee, you're eligible for those things. I should flag they're complicated depending on your circumstances, depending on what your employer might do, et cetera. So you don't have the full range of immigration statuses available to you, but those permanent statuses, you could theoretically go from parolee and file what's called adjustment of status and get a green card based on those pathways.
Okay, on that same, I should say in parallel, a question that we got in advance, but would love for you to touch on again is someone that said that they entered the US using a B1, B2 visa. What are the options to upgrade the status?
So that's tricky. You have a status, so you can change your status. You could go from B1 to, let's say, some kind of work visa. The problem for you, I think, is going to be timing. Applying for those work visas, if you get an employer that wants to sponsor you for a work visa, getting that approved. As you may be aware, the H-1B, for example, is one of the major work visas, but it's only available through a lottery in April of each year. So you'd have to wait a year and a half for that to become available again, basically. And it doesn't become available until October. If you are a superstar in your field, there's something called an O1 visa that you might be able to self-sponsor for, or you might be able to have an employer sponsor you for, but those are very difficult to get. The question you have, I think, is, if I'm on a B1, do I go out and try to get back in on a U4U so then I can get work authorization, et cetera? That may be a quicker path. But as I said, going out and coming back in on U4U is a little strange if you've already been here, and I hesitate to recommend that. But it's worth, if you think, I think honestly the easiest path for a lot of Bs might be to try to see if you can enroll in school somewhere, in a university program or a master's program. That'll give you a bit more time. That'll be more flexible. Obviously, it's going to come at a cost. Maybe you don't have that, the money to cover that, but there may be aid available, et cetera. So that might be one pathway. Go get a master's and then start working based on that master's. That might provide you with a pretty good forward path. But essentially, your main options are U4U, going out and coming back in on U4U, and then something like a student visa or a work visa, but the work visa is likely to be complicated and need the employer to help you.
What about asylum, Daniel? Can you touch a little bit on that possibility?
That's true. Asylum is a thing. Unfortunately, let me just talk briefly about what you have to show with asylum. To establish asylum, you have to show that you fear persecution. Persecution could be being thrown in jail, being harmed physically or killed or something like that, from your government or forces the government cannot control, and for a protected ground like religion or your political opinion. That's very complicated right now, just based on what's happening in Ukraine, which is obviously the Ukrainian government thankfully still controls most of the territory, but not all of it. You probably would fear harm not from your Ukrainian government, but the Russian government. Is that a force that the Ukrainians can't control? Probably. Does Ukraine want to harm you based on a protected ground? Well, I don't know. Is it based on the political opinion or based on their need for more their desire for more territory? Like, it's very complicated to make all of those showings right now, just because so much is up in the air. It may be if you are, let's say you're LGBTQ, or let's say that you are a minority religion, you may have a good claim that you can explore with a immigration lawyer. But it's difficult for me to say all Ukrainians are going to be able to get asylum because there's so much that's just unknown. And so, yes, that is a path. If you are a B1, it may be worth going to an immigration lawyer, explaining your circumstances and seeing whether that person thinks that you might have a good asylum claim, because you might, but that's very individualized, and a lot of stuff is uncertain right now.
Are there any other questions from the audience, participants? I'm not seeing any more questions come through. So this presentation today was recorded. We will make sure that everyone that's joined today has access to the recording once we publish that. So we will be back in touch with you to make sure that you have this information to listen back to and look back to at a later date. Thank you so much again, Jill and Daniel, for being here and for sharing your wealth of knowledge. It's so incredibly helpful to have some of these resources and to know where to go, what more to be researching, and what to be looking for on these journeys. So we really appreciate your time. And thank you to everyone who joined today as well. It's great to have you here with us, and we're glad to welcome you here. Thank you for being here and for joining.